Welcome to Budget Outlaws. Today we're going to be talking on the continuing saga of the 914 that has gotten in a wreck, and right front and the left side were both hit hard by trees. So this will be the discussion of measuring the car and taking measurements from a known good car as well as from the Porsche established guidelines. So this is a good time to bring up the 914 World website. They have just a tremendous amount of information out there that is in the old archive threads or in the current threads, and there's just a ton of knowledgeable people out there that will help you with it. Just anything you can think of on your 914, whether you're rebuilding it or just doing a simple repair. And then what I found on there was the chassis measurements, the bottom side and then the top side as well. And so using those sheets, I was able to get a good solid feel for what the measurements should be, and then taking the known good body that I have, and I was able to measure against that and come up with the measurements that I wanted to utilize. So I took that sheet and I transferred the measurements that I wanted to use onto this photo that I printed out, and was able to come up with the set of measurements that I wanted to use for my repair. So I started taking some measurements. Most of them I could just do with a tape measure, but I made a tool. I'll get into that a little bit later. So these measurements were the before pictures from the donor car that had a good body. They pretty much matched or were real close to the original measurements that the Porsche document had. I should go ahead and point out that I was extremely exact in my measurements, trying to get it down to the 16th of an inch, and knowing that that wasn't really necessary, but knowing that my measurements could be just off by a little bit made me feel a little better that I was trying to be as close as I could. And so I went ahead and made those measurements and recorded them. Then I moved on to the bottom of the car. So now in theory the bottom measurements should be taken care of by just putting it on the jig, but I wanted to go the extra step and make sure that we double checked everything against both the blue car and the factory measurements. So these are the measurements from the blue car, and taken from that point where they all go to towards the front measurements. There's a spot in between the driver's and the passenger's feet. That's a rectangular box underneath the car, and the center point of that box is where those measurements are taken from. So it's important to make that calculation correctly, and these are the measurements taken from the white car with what few spots I could measure. Again, the box in the back of the tub square or rectangular measured out really good, so it was only the ones towards the front there where the hit was taken was the problem. Now many of these measuring points are hard to get to with just a regular tape measure, so I fabricated this measuring. It's just really a large caliper is what it is, and then we measure the caliper itself to see what the actual measurement is. Here's an example of measuring a point to point on the front of the car. Then you just lay the tape measure across the tips and it works. If you had to do that with a tape measure, the tape measurement or the measurement would be, could be half an inch longer going around an obstacle. So this worked pretty well from underneath. It also worked as on top for these sections here where the point of measurement was recessed or had to go around an obstacle. Underneath it was important to do because the four corners, the measurements were they're kind of a large, the jack points are a large round hole, so measuring it from the two ends of the round hole is the easiest way to do that. With a large tape measure, you end up taking a little bit off of it because now you're measuring it from a point within that hole instead of at the very edge of the hole. So anyways, that worked really well. Got pretty precise measurements. We also took some measurements on the side. There was just a couple there that were important to maintain, and also to make sure that we didn't have some damage there that we didn't realize. The caliper came in handy on this as well as going around the door frame there. It was difficult to get a tape measure to go straight across there. So this was the completion of our measuring, and the next step is to determine where to cut and to make the cuts and begin that process. So stay tuned.